Were the Ten Commandments in effect before Moses? And to some, this might be a ridiculous question because some people believe that now the law is not even in effect today at all. And again, it's not my purpose to go over and talk about that. Some believe it was given to just the Jews or just the Israelites. Again, they don't make that distinguishment between the Jews and the Israelites. And in fact, even some of the Jews don't even make that distinguishing characteristic. I think yet to find a Jew that I've talked to that knows anything about the modern day Israelites. So nonetheless, the point is, some of them say, well, oh, no, this whole law thing, that was just given just to the Jews, and was given to them over there in Exodus 20. And that's when the Ten Commandments were given the very first time. And so, since they were given only at that time, they are not applicable to us today, because it was this special law that was done just for them. So whenever we go and look at the Bible, of course, some of this might be ridiculous at face value, and to others this may make perfect sense. So either way, we're going to go through it today and answer this question: were the Ten Commandments in effect before they were given at Mount Sinai in Exodus 20 to Moses and the Israelites? And I guess another kind of corollary or another way of asking it is, were the Ten Commandments in effect from creation? Is another way of looking at it. So let's begin in the New Testament, actually. Let's turn over to Romans 4 and verse 15. And we want to define a few things when it comes to law. Okay, this is the New Testament, which I believe most people have no problems with. I mean, a lot of people have problems with the Old Testament and the relevance that it has in our life, which again is a misconception. But we're going to go to the New Testament, and we're going to define about law and sin, this correlation between these two. Romans 4 and verse 15 says, and just we'll skip into the thought because we're just looking for a definition here, but it says, "For where there is no law, there is no transgression." All right, so where there is no law, there's no sin, basically he's saying. Now, what Paul is not saying here, he's not saying that there is no law, but he's just making the point. And again, if you've ever done logic, if P implies Q, then not P implies not Q. So here we have no law, then there's no sin. So he's speaking, again, theoretically, because he later says, as we will define and show, that there is a law and that there is sin, and that there's actually even a penalty that comes with sinning. But so the point is, though, and this is what we need to understand, if there's no law, then there's no sin. So if there was no law, no Ten Commandments before Moses, then we're not going to see any instance of sin in the Old Testament, or in the very beginning of the Old Testament before Exodus 20. So that should make sense. But if there is sin, then that implies that there is a law. Now, keep your finger here in Romans, in 1 John 3:4. Let's do another defining scripture. 1 John 3:4. And we'll take the time to look at these. Sometimes we just quote them because they are memorization scriptures. But for the new viewer, we're going to go through and define these things. Now, 1 John 3:4, "Whoever commits sin also commits lawlessness," or anomia, against the law. And sin is lawlessness. Sin is the breaking of the law. The King James Version says, "Whoever commits sin transgresses the law." For sin is the transgression of the law. Sin is the breaking of the law. Again, this fits perfectly, obviously, with the things that Paul said, and that we've already read, and the things that we're going to soon read that he does say. Because sin is the same as breaking the law. It's not just doing bad things per se, all right? But it's going against what God says and what He has defined as right and good. And that specifically is sin and a sin against God. All right, so back to Romans. Let's turn to chapter 6 and verse 23. Romans 6 and verse 23. For the wages of sin is death. So the penalty of sin, what you earn for working sin, for committing a sin, the wages that you deserve are death. Okay, so again, this also means that if there is no law, then there's no death penalty either. Right? Turn back a chapter, please, to Romans 5 and verse 12. And we're still putting all these things together, try to put them together logically, reasonably, soundly, as the Bible has it, a little bit here and a little bit there. Now, Romans 5 and verse 12. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, thus death spread to all men because all sinned. Right? So, he's talking about Adam here, that one man through which sin entered, and death. Why is there death through sin? Because it's the penalty for sin, the wages of sin. Right? And then thus death spread to all men. How? Because they all have all sinned. Right? Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Again, you can write that in your notes, or you can go look at it just in case you don't believe me, but it says all have sinned. So they all fall short, and what do they deserve? And why is it that they've sinned? Because they've broken the law of God. Now, it's talking about Adam here, that Adam was the first man, and he sinned. So then, back to Romans 4:15, just in your mind if you wish, it says, no law, no sin. So if through this first man, Adam, there was sin, that meant that there was law. So, QED, right? Quote erat demonstratum, is that, so therefore, we've demonstrated by all this that there was law from the beginning. From the beginning, when Adam sinned, the only way he could sin was if there was a law. And it says that he did sin, and we do know this. So by the very fact that Adam sinned, it means that the law was in effect from the very beginning, from the creation. Not just right before Moses, not at Moses at the time of, and we say Moses in terms of, generally speaking, of Sinai, Mount Sinai, and the giving of the Ten Commandments. But this was in effect from the beginning. So, just looking ahead, I might be getting a little ahead of myself. So, basically, though, what we see is that there was no sin in the world until Adam and Eve broke the law. So it shows that the law has been around then since the beginning, if there was sin at the time. So we see then it was not initially given at Mount Sinai in Exodus 20, where the Ten Commandments were written down by the finger of God, the God of the Old Testament, on tablets of stone. Sinai was merely a re-giving of the law. Okay, it was a codification, if you will, of the law for them, written in this table of stone by the hand of God, so that they would have something that they could see, and that there was no doubt as to what it was that they were supposed to be doing. But it was nothing new. And probably, to many of them, even though they had been in Egypt for so long, they still knew some of these things. But he was going to make it for sure. Now, verse 14 of Romans 5, it says, nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses. So even Paul is saying that here, that even the subject of today's message is that because of sin, death reigned from Adam up until Moses, until this time. He's saying during this whole period, there was a law that was in effect, that was being broken, and that's why, through the sin, that death reigned. So, if it had begun at that time, okay, if the law had indeed begun at the time of Exodus 20, when it was written down on the tablets, then an argument could be made that it may have been just for the Jews. An argument could be made that it could actually be discontinued at some point, because it did not exist before that point, and now it only exists right now at this time. But that is not the case, as we're seeing. And I'm belaboring the point because I want to make it very clear as to what the Bible is saying, what the Bible means, and what the condition was at that time. And these things all fit together with other things that we have gone over in the past, and maybe I'll refer to as we go through the rest of the message. But nonetheless, the point is that from Adam to Moses, there was a law. So to sum up, what we've seen is that the law was in full force and effect. Okay, you know what I mean by that in this time period that we're talking about? It meant that, yes, if you sinned, then you got the death penalty at that time. That there were these laws that were put into place, and that there's a penalty for breaking those laws. And again, this should not be any type of rocket science, because we still know today, even with man's laws, that if you break them, there's a penalty for it, right? I won't even get you started on the ticket I got earlier this week that was completely unjustified, but nonetheless, there's a penalty that goes with it, even though, okay, you want to know now, I went to court and they were willing to kind of wipe it away, but they still wanted their money, so I didn't get any points. Instead of give them $95, and they gave me puppy dog eyes, said, we really feel sorry for you, but you can go to court if you want. And there's a chance, though, if you do go to court and you want to exercise your rights, is that you'll have to pay $2,750. And I said, I've already wasted enough time, so I moved on. The point is, there's a penalty, right? And we all recognize that. And this penalty has been in effect since the beginning of man with God's law. Now, let's look at some specific examples of how it was that the Ten Commandments specifically were in force before Exodus 20. You go, okay, well, how can this be? How can this be proven? How can we see that the Ten Commandments, because they were given at this time, and they hadn't been, everybody recognizes Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, if you want to add that one in, that it was given at this time. But how could we go back and prove it? Well, you can. And again, this is what Bible study is about, right? Now, I want to begin with, and we're not going to go in order necessarily yet, or not even at all, in terms of 1, 2, 3, 4, because it'll flow a little bit better if we don't, but you can try to keep track, and I'll make sure that I go through all 10 of them. But I want to begin with the fourth commandment, okay? Because most professing Christians do not have a big problem with the other 9. Most of them say, okay, yeah, even today I have no problem with the fact that you shouldn't kill, right? They don't have a problem with pretty much the other 9, but there is one that they have the biggest problem with, and that is the Sabbath. So I want to begin with it and look at this one and show, and it's not going to take that long, we'll look at only a couple of sets of scriptures and show that the Sabbath was in effect and in force before Exodus 20. And that, thereby, it wasn't just for the Jews, and it was made for all man. Let's look at Exodus 20 and verse 8. And we'll read the command one time. And it's interesting that even within the command itself, when you look at it and you study it and you realize what it's saying, that even the command itself points to a time before the giving of the command. Exodus 20 and verse 8, and it's a very short command. Let's read it together. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. What in the world does that say about everything before? How does that say anything about it? Well, first off, let's look at two things that we're going to bring out. First off, it says keep. It says keep it holy. Okay, he didn't say make it holy, right? He said to keep it that way because it was already that way. You know, if somebody comes to you and they give you something and it's in a different way and they say keep it this other way and it's not that way, then you go, okay, well, how am I supposed to keep it that way if it's another way? Well, you can't because it's another way. So it's delivered to them, it's delivered to us, a specific way, and we're to keep it that way, the Sabbath day. So what does it mean, holy? How is it that we keep it holy? Well, holy simply means set apart. And of course, it's implied that it's set apart by God. God has the ability to set things apart and set it aside and said, this is special, right? This is holy. I'm setting it aside. I'm distinguishing it from everything else. He said, keep it that way. Right? God set it apart for us to keep it once a week. He set this one day, the seventh day of the week, which is Saturday. It's Friday night to Saturday night. That is the Sabbath. He said, keep the Sabbath. So we can't go keep anything else and say that that's holy because God didn't make it that way. God only made this one, and we are to keep it that way. Now, the other thing, number 2, is remember. Okay, how do you remember something that you haven't been told? He's telling them to remember. Remember what? Okay? So you remember last week when I was telling you what the quadratic equation was? Okay, don't forget that. You're going, what? Okay, hold on a second. You didn't tell us that last week. How am I supposed to even know what that is? Everybody except you. How are you supposed to know what that is? Well, you can't remember it if you never knew it, right? Now, if I said, okay, remember that I said be here at 1:30, we're going to start at 1:30? You go, yeah, okay. Well, yeah, of course you remember it because you were told before. So this implies, again, that the Sabbath was not something new. And this can be divined from just this one scripture right here, Exodus 20 and verse 8. But that's not all. Let's turn back to Exodus 16, verse 26. Exodus 16 and verse 26. And, of course, 16 comes before 20. So we're going to a set of scriptures, Exodus 16, verses 26 through 30. And we're going to see, at a time pre the giving of the 10 Commandments on tablets of stone, the writing by God's finger at this one time, this re-giving, this codification, is that there was an injunction already to the Israelites to keep this. And so we're showing that, yeah, they knew this from before. Exodus 16 and verse 26. 6 days you shall gather it, talking about the manna, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, okay, there's only one 7th day, no matter what the Catholics do with their little calendar, right? They can start it on Monday and end it on Sunday. Everybody still knows the 7th day is the Sabbath, the last day of the week, Saturday. He said, on the 7th day of the Sabbath, there will be none, no manna. I think most of us remember the story. Now it happened that some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather, and they found none. They were supposed to do a double portion on the 6th day. And the Lord said to Moses, how long do you refuse to keep my commandments and laws? Again, he's not only saying that the Sabbath was to be kept and continued to be kept and was in effect before Exodus 20. But he's also throwing the Sabbath in with what? His commandments. Again, it's not my purpose to go and show that commandments almost always refers to the Ten Commandments. In fact, you can go look at that in the New Testament when they talk about it. It's talking about the Ten Commandments. It's understood. It was shorthand. But in a general view, it means all of God's commandments anyway. And my laws. This is the law of God, that we are to keep the commandments. Again, we've spoken, I think I gave 6 messages on the Sabbath in the New Testament. That's just the New Testament. We're not even talking about the Old Testament. It purposely stayed away from the Old Testament. And it still took, 6 hours. And I'm still trying to finish up the booklet, which is getting longer and longer all the time. It's not a booklet, it's a book. It's over 100 pages. So it's just in terms of trying to make it as a something that's a reference material, as it were, so that you can go back and you can look at all these things. But there's that much information just in the New Testament about keeping the Sabbath. And the Sabbath, and a lot of people will say, okay, yeah, the Sabbath, yeah, that's Old Testament stuff. But here we're even seeing it's not just Exodus 20 and later stuff, it's from the beginning, before there were Jews. So, verse 29, see, for the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, he gives you on the 6th day bread for 2 days. Let every man remain in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the 7th day, because they were to be resting. And, verse 30, so the people rested on the 7th day as commanded, on the Sabbath that God gave to them. Not that they conjured up on their own, but as God designed it to be. So what we're seeing here then, to be clear, that this is well and truly before Exodus 20. This is Exodus 16. And so this cannot be seen as part of that codification that happened in chapter 20. But we have another example, because some people might come up with some excuse. Okay, I'm not giving that to them because there is no excuse in terms of the fact that this is a separate incident from Exodus 20. But some people will say this, that, or the other thing. But there's another one that's yet even earlier, Genesis 2. Most people skip over this because they don't see it. It's not reflected in most versions of the Bible. But Genesis 2, verses 1 through 3. Now we're going back, way before Exodus 20. We're going back to the creation week. Exodus 2, verses 1 through 3. Thus the heavens and the earth and all of the host of them were finished in the first 6 days. And on the 7th day, God ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. So we see that God sanctified the 7th day. He set it apart for a reason, as an example. But what is it that even makes this thing even more of a proof, and something that we need to understand and see that this was from the beginning, is that the word for rested in Genesis 2, verses 2 and 3, is Shabbat. He Sabbathed on the 7th day. He kept the Sabbath. He created the Sabbath on the 7th day, and he set it apart and made it holy for us to keep. So the word, again, is, if you want it, it's Hebrews 70 or Strong's 7673, and you can look it up, and even to, the newest of people are the ones who don't understand anything about other languages. You look at it and then you see it and go, what does that word look like? Well, it looks like exactly what it is, like the Sabbath. Now, in case there's any doubt, we can have a look. Let's just have a quick look at Exodus 23, verse 12. Okay, so 23 is after Exodus 20, right? After this giving of the 10 Commandments on stone, the codification, the re-giving. It says, 6 days you shall work, 6 days you shall do your work, and on the seventh day you shall rest. Again, after the giving of the Sabbath, the fourth commandment, the reiteration, and this is not the only one. There's chapter 34, there's Leviticus 26, and a whole bunch of other places where it says this, but the word here for rest, what they were to do on the Sabbath, is the same exact word that is used in Genesis 2:2 and 2:3. It's the Sabbath. So what we're seeing here then is that God created the Sabbath. Right? You have to understand that too. 6 days he did all this work and all this other creation. On the seventh day, when he stopped his work, he still created. He created something. He created a day of rest. A seventh day that does not tie into any heavenly bodies, right? So the moon, we can get our month. The sun, we can get our year. But the week's not tied into anything. It's something that he specifically set apart for many reasons, among which one is that we need it physically, and two is that it was a day to refocus our efforts and our basically our focus onto God. So God knew what we needed in terms of not just physically, but he knew what we would need spiritually, and he designed this day, this specific day, without getting into proving all the other reasons that we keep the Sabbath. He gave us this, and these, again, back to the original point, this was for Adam from the very beginning. It was for the rest of mankind, all the way through to Moses, and then even after Moses, where he reiterated it, that the Sabbath was a day to be kept. Now, most people will agree that there is a day to be kept. They just don't agree that it's the Sabbath. But nonetheless, here it is, here's what it's saying, and here's showing that it was not given at Exodus 20, and it was given from the very beginning, and it was made for man, as Mark 2 talks about. Now, that being said, let's spend the rest of the time, the remainder of the time, on the other examples of the Ten Commandments. And we won't spend a lot of time. I think we all know what the Ten Commandments are. We'll just go through and make the point quickly and just show that there were, in most cases here that we're going to see, repercussions that are directly associated with the breaking of one of the Ten Commandments. And in some cases, even specifically spelling out that it was a sin. All right, and what's the sin? Breaking the law. And so if they did this, it was breaking that law. And we see that even though it was not codified, that it was still in effect. So just because the Bible does not say specifically in terms of, God sat down with them and told them the Ten Commandments, does not mean that he did not do it, for one. And then we can also see indirectly that he did do it, and that not only did Adam and Eve know it, but many of the other fathers, as we call them, knew it and lived by them and did them. So while we're here in Genesis 2, well, I guess we went over to Exodus. Should have told you to stay there in Genesis 2. Let's cover commandment number 1 and 5. So we've done 4. Let's look at 1 and 5. Genesis 2, verses 16 and 17. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in that day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. So God's saying, okay, I'm telling you right now, this is a command. Don't eat from that tree. Okay, if you do, you will die. It's something that I'm setting in motion, and it's something that you need to obey. So Adam and Eve, by eating of the tree, they broke the first commandment, right? That you should have no other gods before you, right? Because now what happened in that incident? They decided to listen to the God of this world, right? They put something else before God, because God said it. They decided to do something else. They put something else in front of God. And not only that, but God is and was their father. He physically created them. All right? And even if you want to put in your notes, Luke 3:38, it calls Adam the son of God. And it's talking physically, not talking spiritually. So it's going through the genealogies there. Also, Joshua 24 and verse 2. And maybe I'll just cite that one for you. But the point I want to make about Joshua 24 and verse 2, and even some of the others that are actually after the giving of the Exodus 20, the commandments at that point, is that it refers to a time before. In Joshua 24:2, it said, Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, your fathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham, the father of Nahor, dwelt on the other side of the river in old times, and they served other gods." So here Joshua is making the point that you do not put any god or anything that you make. And it's supposed, I can't even remember now if it was Josephus or somebody, thought that Terah, Abraham's father, was actually an idol maker. I'm not sure if there's any truth to that rumor or not, but nonetheless, they still served them. And there was, other mentions throughout history of idol makers who sell idols to people. That's reflected even in modern literature and media and whatnot. But the point is that Joshua here is saying, okay, obviously you do not serve other gods. Now, Genesis 3, verses 4 through 6, just a chapter over if you stayed there. Genesis 3, verses 4 through 6. It says, "Then the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not surely die. For God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave to her husband with her, and he ate." So what are the commandments that were broken at that point? Of course, we know, and again, I'm looking for an answer from the audience. What was it that was done that was a breaking of one of the, or more, of the 10 commandments? Because we know what the outcome of it was, right? There was a punishment of banishment, right? And that they did eventually die. So, anyone?
Serpent lied.
Okay, so they lied, but, and again, we'll address that one a little bit later. That was Satan who did that. But what did the people do?
Honoring your mom and dad.
Well, yeah, okay, so that was,
What your mom and dad told you.
so they continued to not do that. They continued to dishonor the parents. And what we're going to see too, and keep this in mind, maybe I'll cite it later, but James talks about how the law of God goes together. That when you break one part of the law, you break all of it. And what we'll see as we go through this is that you're going, well, this one and this one and this happened, and if you look at this in terms of the spirit of the law, then surely this happened. And you start looking at things and you're going, okay, well, this is just all fitly framed together whenever you look at all these things. But what is it? What else did Eve do?
Was that the-
She took,
She
she stole. Okay, it was.
She handed it to somebody else.
Yeah, and she didn't help anybody else out by handing it off. But yet she stole something that was not hers. And what does it say? Why did she do this?
Coveted.
She coveted. Exactly. So she lusted after it and she coveted. And what were the consequences of that? Well, again, we're not even going to get to it, but they were banned from the Garden of Eden. Cherubim were placed with flaming swords. They were never allowed back into it. And again, when you think of Eden, you think of paradise, obviously. But nonetheless, there was a consequence. And subsequently, as I already said, they all died too. They eventually died. Now, well, they didn't die immediately, but they died, period. And so we can, again, figure out things from that I don't even want to get into now. But, okay, let's look over at chapter 4, verse 6. Look at another one. Again, what we're seeing is that there are, consequences here. That there was a breaking of a law, a sin, and a penalty to follow. 4:6. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? If you do not do well, sin lies at the door. And its desire is for you, but you should rule over it." Okay, so he's telling him, said, look, I see what's coming here. I know your heart and your mind. I see what's going on with you and your brother Abel. I see that you're upset that I favor his offerings over your offerings, not because of what it is, so much as how it's given and how he's given the best and he's given with the right attitude. And you're not. And I see that sin lies at the door. And then what happens in the very next verse? Now Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. Right? So, what was the sin? What was the killing? Obviously. And it was right there, and it's associated. And obviously, again, people don't have problems so much with this that he killed him, that was a sin, that was a problem. But for it to be wrong, for it to be a sin, there had to be a law against it. And God sat down and educated Adam and Eve, and it was for them to pass on to their kids as well. And they did. Especially when you live 930 years, you got lots of time to talk, right? And to pass things around, because there was no screen time, right? I was going to say all the things. It used to be just TV when I was growing up. But no, there's nothing. None of the games, right? None of the computer stuff, none of the internet stuff. They sat around, they talked, they did their other things too. They worked their 6 days a week. So what happened to Cain? Well, he was banished, and he was worried. What he was worried about was that people were going to kill him, because he knew what the penalty was for what he had done. He had killed his brother, right? And the penalty for that was, again, death. And he was afraid that some others, his other brothers and sisters, might take it out on him and kill him. And then also, verse 9, he goes, "Then the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel your brother?" He gave him a chance, right? To do the right thing, say the right thing, to repent, change. No. What did he say? I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? So he compounded what he'd done with a lie. And because of those things, he was cursed and sent out from the land, and he had to go to Nod, which was east of Eden. So he lied, which was number 9, but he also killed, which was number 6. Let's go ahead and look at Genesis 27. Actually, let's go ahead and we'll just skip that one. Just put it in your notes if you want. Genesis 27, 31 through 35. I have several examples. And that's the thing. We're just trying to come down to more of the more salient ones, poignant ones, in terms of the examples. So go over to chapter 30, verses 31 through 33. I think it says a little more succinctly. But the first one was basically Jacob lying to his father and getting the blessing and stealing it from Esau. And, he was said, hey, Isaac said, your brother came to me with deceit. He stole these things from you because, he lied. Obviously, a bad thing. So, but chapter 30, I think, makes a little better correlation. Verses 31 through 33. So he said, what shall I give you? And Jacob said, You shall not, he's talking to Laban, you shall not give me anything. If you do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep your flocks. Let me pass through all the flock today, removing from there all the speckled and spotted sheep, and all the brown ones among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the goats. And these shall be my wages. Okay, so he said, as I stay here and I grow this flock, these are the only ones I will keep. Okay? Then he goes, verse 33, so my righteousness will answer for me in time to come, when the subject of my wages comes before you. Everyone that is not speckled and spotted among the goats, brown among the lambs, will be considered stolen if it is with me. So he's saying that he's going to be righteous. First off, he says, my righteousness, period. He's talking about how he knows that he should be. He knew of a way of righteousness that he had been taught, a way to live, a way that God had delivered to Abraham, then to Isaac, and then down to Jacob, of way to be. And in this, he said, I will not steal from you. He said, I will take just these things, otherwise you can count it as stolen. And he knew that was something that he shouldn't do. And now that I even think about it, when they left, one of his wives stole some stuff, and again, he got in trouble. He knew that it was trouble for her stealing, I think it was an idol, wasn't it? The idols that she stole and brought with him, which again carries problems, consequences, and whatnot. So the thing is that, as Jules was bringing out before, was that, the serpent lied. Okay, so he's the father of lies. John 8:44, I think, says that he was that first one. He's the one that implemented it. Now, of course, we all know what Satan's final result will be. And now he's not going to be killed because he's a spirit being, but he's going to be locked up forever in the abyss, the pit, as it is. But again, that is the consequence for him living an ungodly life, for lying, as he did in the garden, lying to Eve, lying throughout history, continuing to lie, and being the father of it. Number 2, let's turn to Genesis 35. A few more chapters down the road. So, and again, like I said, that a lot of these things bleed over into other things. When I look at all the commandments, and you say, okay, well, you don't have any other gods before you, and you don't make graven images. Not that graven images are gods, and not that there are any other gods, but he does define these things and spell both of these things out. And they're both forms of idolatry, and whenever you start considering all the 10 commandments, you start seeing how breaking any one of the commandments really is a form of idolatry. And to a large degree, how breaking any of the commandments is a form of coveting. In terms of, you want something more than what you should want it, than you should have. And again, putting anything else before what you're supposed to do is putting God second. So you can see how these will still break the spirit of the law. And whenever James talks about offending in one point, that you've offended in all, then you can kind of see how, and from where he's talking. But Genesis 35, verses 1 through 4. God said to Jacob, arise, go to Bethel, dwell there, make an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you fled from the face of Esau your brother. So he has these instructions to leave from where he is to go here. Well, Jacob said to his household and all that were with him, put away the foreign gods, these graven images, these things that you've cut out of wood and stone and made out of gold. Put them away from you and purify yourselves and change your garments. So Jacob already knew. So God's telling him what to do. Last thing Jacob's going to do is bring all these foreign gods to where the true God wants him to go and to make an altar to him, because he's the only God that there really is. So then Jacob says, arise and go up to Bethel, and I will make an altar there to God, who answered me in the day of my distress and has been with me in the way which I have gone. So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods which were in their hands and the earrings which were in their ears, and hid them under the terebinth tree which was by Shechem. So they got rid of them. Jacob knew what he was supposed to do, and the last thing he was going to do here was go before God at a place where he was supposed to set up an altar with these foreign gods, and thereby breaking the second of the 10 Commandments. Number 7, Genesis 39. Genesis 39 verses 7 through 9. Again, we're going to go through this. We'll go through it one time here. We're going to, it's a Bible study basically, and we're going to show, as we were showing, that they were all, in one way or the other, in effect, before Moses. So it can be a little bit laborious, but I assure you, there are many more examples of these things that are happening, that are going on, that can be tied directly into many of the other 10 Commandments. But Genesis 39 verses 7 through 9. It came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph. This is Potiphar's wife, on Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." But he refused. Okay, well, that might not be something one way or the other, but let's keep reading. And he said to his master's wife, "Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house. He has committed all that he has into my hand." Joseph had become a loyal and trusted servant. "There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me, but you, because you are his wife." That's the only thing that he's kept from Joseph. "How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" So it was a great opportunity to say that it was against, Potiphar's wife or Potiphar. But no, Joseph knew. And this is what we're getting at. And there's this thread, this commonality through them. Joseph and Jacob and Isaac and Abraham. They knew God's ways, just as Adam and Eve did and just as Moses did. And this occurred some 250 years before Mount Sinai. So again, we've made this gap. There's this huge gap between this. They had not even gone to Egypt. Well, this was the beginning of it at this time with Joseph. So going into Egypt, Joseph knew what the law of God was. And he stuck to it to a large degree. You put Genesis 20 verses 1 through 9 down. Again, it's the story of Abraham and Sarah and Abimelech. And just the main verse there, verse 9 I think it is, says, Abimelech said, "This is a great sin that you are going to let me commit," because Abraham had told a white lie, a half-truth, which is still a lie. And when you lead somebody to believe something other than what the real truth is, Sarah was his, I never get it right, half-sister. I think it was his father's daughter, but not his mother's daughter, that he was married. That's Sarah. And he said, "Well, this is my sister." And so Abimelech took her and was going to lie with her, and God prevented it from happening in a dream. Abimelech woke up and go, "How is it that you're going to let me commit this great sin?" And he called it, again, a great sin. And it's against God, against his 10 Commandments. And it was number 7. Number 3. Let's go to Leviticus 18. And number 3 is, by my count, the last one that I'll be covering. It's still number 3. 1, 2, and 3, and then 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yep. So we've touched on all of them after this one. But Leviticus 18, verse 3. We'll read 3 through 5 and 21, 26, 27. But we set the stage here in 3, 4, and 5. It says, again, Leviticus 18 is after Exodus 20. So we're talking about, referring to a time before Exodus 20. It says, "According to the doings of the land of Egypt." So they came out of Egypt, Exodus 12, 13, right around there. And of course, we were reading how Joseph was sold into Egypt. So you have all that intervening time there. According to the doings of the land of Egypt, where you dwelt, you shall not do. Okay, so these things that they're doing in Egypt, you're not going to do. And according to the doings of the land of Canaan, where I'm bringing you, you shall not do. All right, so we're not even going to talk about the Canaan ones here. But he goes, nor shall you walk in their ordinance. You shall observe my judgments, keep my ordinances, to walk in them. I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore keep my statutes and judgments, which if a man does, he shall live by them. I am the Lord. So he's saying, okay, their ways were not godly. I want you to live after my ways. Verse 21, you shall not let any of your descendants pass through the fire to Molech, nor shall you profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. So again, the third commandment there, he's saying, you shall not profane. This is what they used to do in the land of Egypt before Exodus 20. And you don't do that because it wasn't good then and it's not good now. Verses 26 and 27, you shall therefore keep my statutes, my judgments, and shall not commit any of these abominations, either any of your own nation or any stranger that dwells among you. For all these abominations the men of the land have done who were before you, and thus the land is defiled. So he was saying he called them an abomination then, a sin, a wickedness, a great evil that they were not supposed to be doing. So all in all, you can go through, you can do these, and we'll just read like one last set of scriptures here. I'll call it the catch-all, Genesis 6, verses 5 through 8. Genesis 6, verse 5 through 8. We can see that they were committing this horrible evil in the land. Such a great evil, that one that could not even be imagined. And they did it all the time. Genesis 6, verses 5 through 8. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man, the evil, the sin that man was committing, right? Because, why? Because there was a law, and we're talking Genesis 6 right here. Wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. You know, to me, that kind of encapsulates it all, right? He's saying that's all they did was just evil. They sinned continually. They did not do anything that I wanted them to do, that I had told them to do. And the Lord was sorry. This is how bad it was. He was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man, right, the wages of sin, whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Noah, who was a preacher of righteousness, as he is called other places. And we know the rest of the story, that God then did indeed start over with 8. He did, as it were, inflict on man the punishment for their sins, which was death. So, and why was that? Because they sinned, because they broke his law. I think, well, let's have a look here. I want to go ahead and show that it wasn't all sin, because Abraham kept the law of God. Genesis 26, verse 5. And again, these are kind of ideas I don't think that people really know, that they don't think through, that they haven't read closely. Their mind's not on it when they come across it. But this simple part of a sentence, one verse, showed that Abraham knew what was right to do and did it. Genesis 26 and verse 5. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So here we are, pre-Exodus 20, again, by a long way, right? This is over 400 years before. Abraham was keeping the law. So there's no doubt that it was in effect, and that Abraham, a friend of God, was living by these things. Not only did he keep them, but know them, but he did keep them. This is why he was a friend of God. Now, the interesting thing is that Deuteronomy 11 and verse 1, I'll make the correlation. Well, let's read it, because obviously it's after Exodus 20, after Deuteronomy 5, where the second giving of the Ten Commandments is given. But Deuteronomy 11, verse 1, it says, "Therefore you shall love your God, keep his charge, his statutes, his judgments, and his commandments always." Well, what's he referring to there? What is being referred to in Deuteronomy 11 and verse 1? Well, he's being referred to, obviously, all the stuff that was in Exodus 20 and all the other commands, the judgments and things that God had given to them. Of course, the interesting part in all of this is that when you look at it, that it says, Abraham kept my voice, my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. And Deuteronomy 11 says, my charge, statutes, his judgments, and his commandments. That it's almost verbatim in terms of what they're talking about there. The Hebrew. When you look at the Hebrew, again, there's little nuances of differences right here, which then don't take away from what I'm saying here in terms of the fact that it is the same thing that Abraham was doing was what they were being told to do in Deuteronomy 11. So again, what was he talking about then in Genesis 26 and verse 5? He was talking about the same thing he's talking about in Exodus 20 that he's been talking about since the creation of man. And this really should not be this big of a reach for everyone. If you remember, and again, even if you don't, you can go look for it, but I gave a message recently on who is the God of the Old Testament. The God of the Old Testament is the one who became Christ. Christ was the God of the Old Testament. And Hebrews 13:8 says, God, or speaking of Christ, does not change. He's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So if this God of the Old Testament who became Christ, if he told the young rich man to keep all the commandments, and the young rich man, I've done that since I was a kid. And he said, I want you to, whenever he was asked, how do what's the great commandment? He says, love God. And then the second is like to it, love man, which is merely a summation of the Ten Commandments. When Christ, the God of the Old Testament, says those things, and he doesn't change, what do you think he believes? What do you think he enacted? What do you think he was telling Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the Israelites, Adam and Eve? He's telling them all the same thing. To be a certain way. Christ did it himself. He lived a perfect life, living by every word of God, not breaking a single commandment because he did not sin. Sin is the breaking of the law. He did not do that, setting the example that we are to follow. Human nature does not want the law of God. It doesn't want to be subject to it. So it's not a surprise that everybody's trying to get rid of it at every turn. But when you completely understand that it is God's nature, as represented by the law, that we're to be putting on, and what I mean by that is that it's the way that God lives. It's the way that God is, in terms of that God says, okay, I don't lie. I cannot lie. So when he tells us to not lie, that's what he's saying. He's saying, I want you to become like me. It is not, when you fully understand it, it is not a burden to keep the commandments of God. And so it shouldn't be seen as this great big deal, this big mystery, that they were in effect from before Exodus 20. That they reflect an eternal God in his character. Because God does not change either, nor does Christ. And because it describes their character today, and it has described it through eternity, then we can easily see how not only in addition to the fact that all the scripture backs it up, but how and why it was in effect from the very beginning.